Panel 2. Tactile, 2.5D and 3D, Approaches to Accessible Comics. Image, a black and white drawing of a hand touching tactile graphics. Text, Tactile Approaches. Panel Moderator: Georgina Clique. Panelists: N. Cunningham, Elon Manowak, Frank Welty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Susanis. As said this morning, I'm the comic studies professor at San Francisco State University, and I'm going to kick off the tactile panel in a minute. But before I do that, just some reminders in case you're just joining us. Just some access notes. So you can turn on captions by clicking the closed captioning button. But for more personalizable captions, you can visit tinyurl.com/longmorecaptions. For better access, we've turned off the chat today. However, we encourage you to use the Q&A box as if it's a chat room. You can pose questions for our panelists, but also share resources and reactions and connect with other attendees. Additionally, we've set up a Facebook group to allow for additional conversation that can continue after today's symposium is over. Check the reminder link we sent to find the link to join that group now. And lastly, we have a hashtag for this conversation, hashtag comicsA11Y. So now, all our panelists, if you could turn on your video, if you have it coming on. Again, this is the tactile panel, and we're going to explore ways that comics have been translated and created from the ground up to be tactile for blind and sighted creators. And we've got Georgina, Frank, Anne, and Ilan, and I'm going to hand it over to you and ask you to introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'll begin. My name is Georgina Clique. I am the moderator of this panel. What we've agreed to do here today is we'll start with some brief introductions, and then each of the panelists will present their material. And then we can have some discussion, and hopefully we'll get some questions. As Nick says, if you have questions as the panel's going forward, you can put them in the Q&A, and we will attempt to address them a little later. Okay, I'll begin by introducing myself. As I say, my name is Georgina Clique. I am a writer and an English professor. I teach at UC Berkeley, so across the San Francisco Bay from the Longmore Institute. I teach creative writing and disability studies. My image description: I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length white hair. I am today wearing a plain white t-shirt, unfortunately no graphics on it. And I am sitting in a room with a window behind me. I don't think there's anything else visible in my room. Just to say a few words about how I come to this panel. What doesn't show in my picture is that I am blind. I've been blind since I was about 10 years old. I have really very little experience of comics. When I was a child, I knew that comic books existed. I knew that my friends read them and talked about them. But I thought it was just one of those things that was just for them, not for me. As an adult, I became aware that there was something called graphic novels. So a similar type of medium meant for an adult audience or a young adult audience, not necessarily just for children. The reason I'm here in this panel, you might wonder, what is she doing here if she knows nothing about comic books, is that I have done a good deal of work about visual art and blind access to museum collections, also blind access to film and television in the form of audio description. But in particular, in terms of museum access, work both around audio description, but also around touch tours. So what availability for touch access to visual arts. And that sometimes takes a number of different forms. It can mean graphic diagrams or graphic reproductions, tactile graphic reproductions of artworks. And then also occasions where people are allowed to touch the artwork themselves. So as Nick says, this panel is going to address both the issue of translation, the possibilities and challenges of translating comics to a tactile medium, but also to think about creating tactile comics from the ground up that would be available to be touched by both blind and sighted consumers. So let me start with Frank. And Frank, if you would introduce yourself, describe yourself, and say a little bit about where you're coming from.
Everyone, I'm Frank Welty, and I am a senior accessible media and Braille specialist in the Media and Accessible Design Laboratory, which we call the MAD Lab, at the Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired in San Francisco. MAD Lab produces accessible media for people who are blind and visually impaired, and we'll be talking more about that shortly. So that's who I am.
Would you like to give a brief visual description of yourself?
Sure. I am a middle-aged Caucasian male with brown hair. I am wearing a business casual, so I've got slacks and a dark collared shirt on, and I'm sitting at my home office.
Okay, great. Thanks, Frank. Let us move to Anne Cunningham. Could you introduce yourself briefly?
Sure, thanks, Georgina. My name's Anne Cunningham, and I'm a sighted woman with fair skin and long salt and pepper hair. And I'm talking to you from my Colorado studio, which is a room cluttered with notes and drawings pinned to the wall, and the ceiling hanging at odd angles. I identify as a fine artist, which includes tactile and visual art. I primarily work in bas-relief or low-relief sculpture. Bas is spelled B-A-S. It's a French word just meaning low. When I began sculpting in the 70s, I started sculpting pictures because I was using slate, and it's a thin medium, and so it just lent itself to this low relief technique. But it wasn't until the early 90s that I wondered if these pictures could be understood by someone who is blind. At that moment, my whole—
Can we briefly pause? Interpreter transition. Okay, we're good. Also, Anne, while I've got you, you're a little faint, so if you can be a little louder, it would help.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Oh, that's much better. Much
Great.
better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. It was in the later 90s that I wondered if my pictures could be interpreted by someone who is blind. And it was at that moment my whole career changed. I began teaching art at the Colorado Center for the Blind in 1999, and my students and I, with complete support from Julie Deeden, the director of the Colorado Center, attempted to find the edge of the envelope or the limits of how art could function tactually. And we're still looking. We haven't found that edge yet. I'm now focused on writing and illustrating children's picture books to provide accessible materials for infants and children who are blind.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anne. And finally, our third panelist is, and correct me if I'm saying your name wrong, Ilan.
Yes, it's you say it right. Yes,
oh, good.
It's Ilan Manwak. Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. Yes, my description is a bit, I don't have a video right now because I'm in a very small island next to the Turkish borders, as I described, with a very flaky, shaky broadband connection. I'm still wearing my swimming suit, so I'm not totally in a conference mode, but I'm quite prepared for the subject, yes. My name is Ilan Manoir. I'm an artist. I define myself as a conceptual comics artist. So my medium, I explore the possibilities of the comics medium beyond what is conventionally understood as a set of skills and traditions. I'm also doing my PhD in Aalto University in Helsinki, in Finland, where I explore what I call comics epistemology, which means somehow how the comics industry is disrupted by is changed by the disruptions brought forward by synthetic media, artificial intelligence, financial technologies, and globalized logistics. So I approach comics somehow from the boundaries, from the periphery, not so much as again a skill of a craft like craftsmanship. And then I also work as an editor and strategy consultant for Onassis publication, which is a new publishing catalog that is tied to the big Onassis organization. The reason I am here is that in 2016, I somehow part of the continuity of my practice had to do with the invention of the conceptualization of a system of tactile communication based on geometric symbols. It's called ShapeReader. And using ShapeReader, I created a comic book, a comic narrative that is all tactile. And this was the beginning of a long journey that went out of comics, came back again, and then went to music, etc. So it's an ongoing project that I will continue for many years on. And I will give a very brief description and kind of a biographical understanding of why ShapeReader, why now, and how it connects with other parts of my work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, panelists. So now we'll get into a little more detail. So we'll go back to Frank and hear more about your work at the Mad Lab.
Sure. So like I was saying earlier, Mad Lab produces accessible media for people who are blind or visually impaired. I'm unmuted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, let me check here.
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay, good. All right. So the work we do includes Braille, large print, or audio materials, but our specialty is tactile graphics, particularly tactile maps. We have also produced tactile comics for several clients, the Disney Museum, Marvel Comics, and a tactile map used in the Daredevil television series. This experience has taught us several important things that need to be considered when designing and producing tactile comics. Making a comic, a map, or any other visual graphic into tactile graphic is not simply a matter of adding raised lines and textures to the image. First, the tactile sense is very different than the visual sense. The eyes distinguish smaller details than do the fingers. The number of colors and shapes that are visually discernible is much larger than the number of textures and lines, thicknesses, and heights that can be recognized by the fingers. This means that any visual image needs to be simplified and possibly enlarged to be understood tactily. If there's one thing you want to remember from this presentation, it is simplify, simplify, simplify. Second, over the years, the comic genre has developed a vocabulary of standard symbols to convey information without using text, such as representing an idea with a light bulb. A congenitally blind reader such as I probably has no experience with this vocabulary. You can't assume that the tactile reader will be familiar with the conventions that are understood by avid sighted comic fans. Third, if you want to include Braille in your comics, be aware that Braille characters are larger than printed characters, about 24 point. And the Braille characters are a fixed size, and the characters and Braille lines are consistently spaced. There are no such things as small Braille type or proportional spacing between Braille characters. Finally, I strongly encourage you to have your tactile work proofread by a blind person to make sure that your designs work as intended. Now let me tell you how MadLab produces tactile graphics. We have two designers on staff, Naomi Rosenberg and BJ Epstein, who may be in the room today, who are both have years of experience creating a wide variety of tactile graphics. Most of our designs are created in Adobe Illustrator, but we also use other tools such as Tiger Designer. Most of our pieces are embossed on paper using graphic embossers from View Plus Technologies, including a couple of high-end embossers that allow us to create full colored pieces with large print, Braille, raised lines, and distinctive filled textures. We also use a Direct Color Systems UV printer to create tactile pieces on a variety of substrates from paper, acrylic, or aluminum, and we could even use others. To learn more about MadLab, visit our webpage at www.lighthouse-sf.org/madlab, or write to us at madlab@lighthouse-sf.org.
Okay, thank you, Frank. We'll come back to you with more specific questions, but let's go from Frank now to Anne to talk about a maker, an artist, to talk about creating tactile artworks.
And then if I can just interject for 1 second, Anne, if you would like me to bring up the images, tell me. And
Yes, can we queue them up just here in a few minutes?
sure, I can. Just 1 second.
Thank you. So I would just like to say there are all sorts of ways to create tactile images, and comics, like any picture, takes the 3D world and distorts it to represent it on a 2D plane by preserving the height and width proportions and eliminating the depth. So to actually represent this information, we need to add a bit of depth to our images and make them accessible. I'm very excited to be talking about comics because raised line drawing boards seem to really support drawing comics. It just feels really natural. Comics are so rich, and I'm excited to explore with you and to see what evolves. I'm really happy to share what I've discovered in my works in the hopes that you might find some part of it useful for yours. We can break tactile pictures into 3 types of images if we break them down one way. And the first is raised line drawing, which is either up or down. So for a raised line drawing, a circle would be represented as could represent a ball with the outline of the circle raised and the background flat. And that could represent a ball or a coin or a ring. And to clarify, you can use textures or different devices, like for a ring, perhaps a double circle. And depending on your audience's experience, you might be able to use perspective. A second type of image is collage. And we can layer many different types of materials and add a lot more information. We can separate objects one from the other in the background much more easily by detecting our hand moving from one material to the next. And the third type of drawings that we can create as sculpted relief pictures or bas-relief. And let me run through a few examples and discuss some interesting features. So any of these techniques that I'm going to be discussing could probably find an equivalent in raised line or collage techniques. So this first image is called Still Mourning, and it's a slate sculpture about 2 feet by 2 feet and 3/4 inch thick. It shows a gold-leafed female mallard duck swimming out of the reeds to the right into clear waters with gentle undulations created by radiating waves and cross currents. This makes the image read visually because it reflects light and creates shadows the way actual water does. What's more is that by moving your hands across the water, the sculpture will gently rock your hands the way water rocks a boat. And when I'm talking about using your hands, I'm talking about using your full palm and fingers on the piece. So I use my hands every way I can think of to make the work more accessible and fun. Let's go to the next image, which is called Straw Boat. There we go. This sculpture is another slate piece. It's about 2 feet high by 3 feet wide. It shows a nude young girl kneeling in a straw boat facing to the right. Her right hand is holding on to the very high prow of the boat. In her left hand, she's holding a fishing rod with the line holding the hook looped over her index finger. She seems to be guided by some sort of mythical character in the sky through choppy waters. This image uses texture to distinguish and emphasize objects in the image. Smooth is a very important texture. By placing it thoughtfully next to other textures, you can really help differentiate information in the picture by using different textures and heights. None of my sculptures are very deep, that the relief isn't very deep. I would guess that the deepest point in this sculpture is probably 3/8 of an inch. The next image is called Sequence. And this shows larger than life rabbits in one of 3 phases of a bunny hop. This image is the original slate piece that I sculpted. It is 13 inches high by 4 feet wide and 3/4 inch thick. I took a mold off of this piece and cast the background in plastic, hard plastic. I coated the surface of the rabbits with a flexible rubber, and I placed 3D printed skeleton on the backside of the rubber. So can we go to the next picture? And that will show us an image of the bones that I used that I created in actually CU helped me with University of Colorado, printed out the bones for me. And then those were fit onto the backside of each rabbit. Then I filled in with a soft foam around each rabbit so that when you access the front of the picture, you feel the rigid plastic background. And so you read that just as a regular background. And then when you get to the rabbits, you find that it's way more than just what visually you could determine. It's now soft, and you can push into it, and it's squishy, and you can feel the bones. So the foam that's surrounding the bones feels like soft texture. Sorry about that noise. Feels like soft tissue. And then the bones really, you can feel the ribs, you can feel the bones in the legs and the skull. And it's really adds a whole new dimension to this piece. And I would just want to shout out to Abby Stengel. She helped me with this piece, and it was a great working relationship. The resulting piece is only truly accessible through touch. In fact, none of my work can be completely experienced without touching them. The next image is called, whoops, out of sync. Could we go skip through a few more? There we go, Wolfpack. So Wolfpack is 3 wolves in different positions. One is stalking forward, one is looking to the right, and the third is looking completely back over his right shoulder. Each is about 12 inches high by 18 inches long and 3/4 inch thick, and has the appropriately different bas-relief contours on each side. So the sides are both carved differently. I discovered that by having each side illustrated, the object from different points of perception, that it is possible to expand on how our mind interprets these objects. I find that people who spend time looking with both hands, one hand on each side of the object, will experience an expansion of the illusion of depth. I think of it as a tactile illusion. It really, when you start exploring and reading the contours with each hand, all of a sudden you feel like the object has far more depth than it originally did, than the 3/4 inch. I think the 2-sided pictures, like in books, might be a good way to get additional information and are worth spending some time on developing them. And that could easily apply to comics, I think. So could we go back to the octopus? Octopi with lots of arms. It's titled. It shows 2 octopuses with tangled arms. Each has a different texture to help separate one from the other. So the one on the right has it's a golden octopus, and it also has a bumpy texture on it. And the reddish brown octopi on the left-hand side is, or octopus, and the left-hand side has a smooth texture. So when you start following these legs or these arms like a maze almost, you can distinguish one octopus from the other. So this is an illustration from Pedro and the Octopus, written by Debbie Kent and published by the American Action Fund. These illustrations are full bas-relief on paper. This is an old technique used by greeting card companies, used for centuries. And it's for large editions, I think it's really good and more affordable way to go. But we're talking about a minimum of $1,500 to make it really useful or affordable. So I would like to just wrap up with one of the ways that I work is that I tell how I know if something is working is I try it. I keep touching my work as I'm going through it. I will draw an image and I'll feel the drawing, even if it's not tactile, because I am sighted. I can tell when I'm on a piece, and I'll start making determinations there if this piece is large enough for my finger to touch things. And once I do that, then I'll start carving it or sculpting it, and I'll keep feeling it the whole time and making sure that it keeps reading easily. If it's not reading for me easily, it's not going to read for anyone else, for sure. So once I get it finished, I'll put it away for a few days, And then I'll pull it out without looking at it and just see how it reads once I'm checking it out again without, like having been getting a little distance from it, that's all. And once it passes all those tests and I'm satisfied with it, then I start testing it with friends who are blind and seeing how it's reading with them. And at that point, I start learning how to describe things as well as how they're working. I can decide what it is that I want to change. And I also start understanding what a good flow for describing this image is. And I only understand that once I start working with other people. So I'd just like to conclude with, what do we need most? What kind of images do we need most? Do we need diagrams, comics, collages, bas-relief, with color, without? And I would say, yes, we need them all. We need all those things, and we need moving pictures too, and those are coming online. I'm so excited. We're so close to that. And so I am so excited to be here and be a part of this new movement into comics. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We're excited to have you here too. Let's go to Ilan and hear, I hope, about the Shape Reader project.
Yes. Thank you very much, Anne and Frank. It was really, really helpful to see how you work and how you understand tactility and comics. I come from a quite different background.
Ilan, can I interject for 1 second? Sorry, so sorry. I have about 6 images queued up, 3 of Shape Reader and 3 of people using it. So you just tell me when, and I'll do it.
Okay, Nick. Okay, great. Okay. I have to take distance from my phone in order to see the screen, but I'll do it.
You don't even have to see it. You just tell me and I'll do it, but I'll keep quiet for now.
So great. So Shape Reader. Yes, so my understanding of tactile comics comes from my earlier practice as a conceptual comics artist, as I introduced. What does that mean, conceptual comics artist? Is a comics artist whose main mode of work is not so much related about the content on the style or the expression, but it's about a certain relation to language, like conceptual art, and also a big distance on a big perspective on skills, on skilling and the skilling, as something that is quite a constituent of the way conceptual comics artists, conceptual artists in general work, and also has to do with the visualization of artistic practices, which is an important feature of most conceptual artistic practices of the 60s and 70s, which the focus of the work was not so much what we would get as an immediate, as a stimuli, but more about the concept of how we can approach a work, how we can understand it, how it relates to the context, etc. So Shape Reader is a system of tactile signification for the production of tactile comic. And I think it will be useful to see how I somehow came to this idea, which was totally a very sensorial thing that I experienced. I was in a residency, in an artistic residency in Finland, in the rural Finland. It was January or February. It was extremely cold. It was full of snow, minus 27 degrees Celsius. And I remember I was working every night on very intensely on a quite more conventional comic book. And I would wake up in the morning and I would see from my window the very snowed landscape. And actually every day the landscape would be different because the traces on the snow were different. They were the results of nocturnal activity from the wildlife of the rural landscapes, rabbits, birds, etc. And I started having a challenge to try to decipher this activity, somehow understand what happened the night and how I could read this activity from the traces in the next day. And it came up to me that actually traces tell stories. Traces have a narrative power. And when we understand this, we try to understand what is the grammar that is behind traces. So how different indexes of the snow can tell specific and can be somehow the marks of specific events that happened. And I thought this was quite interesting to see if I can explore it in comics. So see how a narrative, a comic narrative, could be entirely translated through traces, through relief. And then I understood better that probably we are floating in a world of stories and in a world of narratives, because we every day are becoming aware of different indexes of events happening. The question is, do we have the skills or the grammar or the index or the communication board to understand these narratives? What if every inscription is a part of a narrative? So I wake up with this idea. I contacted the human resources person of the residency and proposed to do a comic book entirely generated with and entirely produced by tactile by relief structures. So the way I worked with this was quite different from the things I saw around me at that time regarding comics, because I totally agree with Frank. It's not enough to just erase the drawings of a regular comic book in order to make it accessible. We have to translate this, and it's not even an adaptation. It's called, in my research, it's called meta-creation. Meta-creation, transcreation is a way to somehow translate something, but for very resistant works of literature, the translation process is a very creative one. And this, for example, refers to concrete poetry from Brazil, which is a poetry that when needs to be translated, it's not enough to just put the new words, because it changes all the composition of the work. Or, for example, with Georges Perec, the very famous Oulipo writer that wrote an entire novel without the letter E. When this book is translated in German, for example, from French or in English, translated as from disparition, it became The Void. So a book that somehow narrates its own procedure. The translation work is a very creative work. It's a work that transforms the works, even sometimes make it totally alien or make totally strange to the original one. And my understanding with approaching comics from a tactile point of view was to reduce everything, to totally forget about the drawings, forget about the characters and their physiques and and try to break down all the semantic elements of a narrative. So Shape Reader, as you might have seen or you see right now, has screens with it's based on a communication board and an index of 210 different shapes, each one carrying a specific reference. So the shapes are broken down to semantic categories. We have, for example, shapes about the characters of the plot, shapes about their feelings, about their actions, about the settings of the narrative, different props and objects. And as Frank also intuited before, we have also shapes that relate to the toolbox of the comics artist. This kind of visual iconic tropes. We have a lot of comics, like the lighting bulb of the idea. All these different concepts were translated into geometric patterns that were included in communication boards that came in different formats, most of them tactile, portable, but also in a museum piece, in a museum setting, very big boards where you can spend a lot of time, tactile ones, also printed ones for sighted people. And so the idea was that somehow somebody should get acquainted with the dictionary of Shape Reader and then get to read the story. And the story was built, so the story is 57 pages of highly pressured laminate plates. It's a Belgian patent actually called Trespa Meteon. It's an industrial material that is used for the isolation of buildings. It has a very, very good finissage for engraving. The plates were engraved with a laser cutter. So you know that is a very, very long and fastidious process, and many things can go wrong. And voila. So it's a comic book that can be only read in a setting, in a gallery or a museum, and in a durational setting. So usually the exhibitions are like from 3 weeks to 3 months long. Yeah, and the book starts, actually, this is something I also find very interesting. I'm a video gamer myself, so I built the difficulty of the book in what is called also in video games dynamic difficulty adjustment. So it starts by very basic shapes. So it starts like a very rough, only with the characters holding, for example, a teacup, very basic. So you can start learning by, like you learn an alphabet or you learn a foreign language. You start from the very basic concept, and then the difficulty somehow builds up the more you advance in the narrative. An important part of Shape Reader is also what the images are shown is the different workshops we have been doing. So a total different setup of plates has been used in tens or hundreds of workshops in different countries, different people, to see how we can build on the spot a small tactile narrative from very different kinds of views. Obviously, this is not entirely common for graphic tactile without text. Yes, and the project evolved. Sorry, one word about the setting of these workshops. They're always mixed. So we have both visually impaired people, participants, and side participants. And also in their capacities, artistics, we have people that are very much acquainted with comics art, and people less so. And I think they're very important to have this kind of mixed in the workshop. It's the most productive, and I see how people learn from their different skills. And one important aspect of these workshops is that people are not only building a new small narrative, they are building the language in order to build this narrative. So it's a constant game of negotiation between them. What does that shape mean? Do we all agree about the meaning of this shape? What kind of words, what kind of concepts do we need to tell our story? So it's a kind of very radical constrained writing by using very basic elements, building blocks, in order to do a story and to have a kind of community-specific language that the participants share at that moment. One very quick word about how Shape Reader evolved. Shape Reader it was a very intimate thing in the beginning, so it needed really a lot of concentration in order to get in the story, to try to understand how it works. The workshops are much more playful, obviously, but the initial was quite intense. And last year, I moved the project from laser cutting to vacuum forming, which is a very interesting technology to provide tactile formations by using prototypes. So MDF, for example, engraved prototypes on a CNC machine, on a router, or on a, and then producing plastic sheets that come from a vacuum forming process from these prototypes. So this is a very, very much cheaper production technique in order to have multiples, in order to create different pieces that can stay in different countries also, because logistics became something quite problematic for my work. And now we're working on an installation that is used by music performers using the same exactly elementary modules that were used in comics, scaled up, and using the Shape Reader as a way to annotate their compositions, their music, their performance. So we worked with 20 different musicians from very different backgrounds, different capacities, different instrumentations, different personal stories, etc. And they spent hours working on the installation and came with a new composition. There's a small video that I can put in the links immediately after to see how the process worked. And the new step that I would like to try now is to make the same with paper. And we're working with this technique of printing without ink. And there's a series of residencies from September on that we're trying to find exact the technique in order to have also a very mobile setting that can travel and can stay to different countries, so that we avoid to have also extremely costly and also costly in terms of money, but also in terms of carbon footprint shippings around the world with the big shapes. So mobility, flexibility is also an important aspect in the design of this, not only of the shape reader, but also of its very shapes, the shapes process. I mean, I can speak up for hours about this, but it's a very interesting to see which shapes translate well in which medium, because it's not a trivial aspect. You know, from when you pass from a very small engraving to a 1 meter vacuum forming process, the shapes have to be very specific in order for the vacuum forming process to work. So it involves a lot of technical knowledge to do it, which obviously when I finished my studies as a comics artist, nobody told me that I should know the vacuum forming process. But this is a pleasure actually when you're an artist to try to always find the new skills and understand how a technique works in order to do your work. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. Okay, this has already been a very rich discussion. I just want to pull out some comments from the three panelists and maybe use those to formulate some questions. And then again, as we go forward, I'm hoping that people are writing in people from the audience are writing in questions in the Q&A, which we will get to in a few minutes. Just to sort of reinforce and repeat some of the things that stuck in my mind. One is, first of all, Frank's very valuable comments about recognizing that touch is there's not a one-to-one analogy between touch and sight. I think sometimes people think that, touch is for blind people exactly the same as sight is for sighted people. And really the psychology, the cognition, the perception of touch and vision are very, very different. And so in contemplating translation or adaptation or creation of tactile comics, one has to take into account the differences between touch and sight. So that's one thing. I also have in listening to the presentations by our two makers, our two artists here, I have to point out the failures of the platform, this video conferencing platform, because it doesn't do justice to the work, because we can hear the work described, but we can't get our hands on it. I have some direct experience of Anne Cunningham's work. I've actually handled some of her work, including the piece Sequence with the bunnies. And I have to say it's a very rewarding piece. It's very memorable. The memory is still in my hands of handling that piece. And finally, I'm fascinated by, as a writer, I'm fascinated by Ilan's work and the idea of narrative, wordless narrative, the idea of traces, of reading traces and accumulating a narrative from what amount to be tactile traces. I wanted to bring something up that, as I say, I don't know that much about comics, but what I do know, I'll bring up, is that that comics combine text and images. That's part of the strength, the what people appreciate about the medium. but I also know that different readers encounter a page of a comic differently, or there are different formats of, classic comics that people encounter differently. So it can be pages where you have panels and you have people talking to each other and their speech appears in speech bubbles above their heads. And basically one reads it from left to right, top to bottom. And then you turn the page and there may be a totally different format where there may be some image that's, large and suggesting some kind of different kind of impact. And so those two different formats, and there are multiple other versions that could come in between, sighted readers encounter differently. And I wonder how that might work in a tactile medium. Another way to say this is I know there's been a certain amount of research done, like with audio description, where people track eye movements of sighted viewers and then try to use that as a guide for scripting audio description. In my own work in museums, when I'm training docents to do verbal description of art, sometimes I ask them, when you look at this painting, where does your eye go first? Recognizing that artists have a lot of techniques to make people look at something first rather than second. And so I guess the question is sort of thinking about sequence and thinking about temporality, the experience of tactility that happens over time. And also if there's the possibility of different people encountering the same object, but approaching it in radically different sequence of touching. I hope that makes sense as a question. Does someone want to leap in, or should I call on someone? All right, let me call on, that's unfair. Let me call on you, Anne, because I have had my hands on your work. And thinking in particular about what you say, what I thought was fascinating about touching with two hands, right, rather than touching with one hand. And I wonder if you could just sort of, brainstorm about sort of the differences in different tactile experiences.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. I really believe that you can experience things differently by getting different parts of your hand onto the surface of the object, like the rocking of the water, and feeling like it really mimics the rocking of a boat. It really brings that back to mind. So obviously, as in all art, I believe that it's always enriched by the visitor's experience that they bring with them to the artwork. So that's one thing. But I feel like I'm balancing a lot of different things when I'm sculpting. And one is giving good accurate information about like the mechanics of whatever I'm picturing, like the outline, an accurate outline, the accurate details, things like that. But then there's also emotional content overlaid onto that. Like I did a portrait of a young girl I collaborated with a blind photographer, and he had a profile of a young girl that he wanted to have made into a tactile exhibit. And so I sculpted that. And when I finished with it, I realized that her cheek, just the way it had been done, it added so much more than just cheek. it felt like a person, you know? It felt like you were really connecting with someone. And it was so much more than just that. You know, there was an emotional content that had been somehow captured.
Mm-hmm. So sort of combination between shape and texture.
Texture and just you know, and how it's relating to each other, and the form. You know, what was so telling about her cheek was that when you look at a person's cheek, I don't think you generally feel the little indentation over the teeth so much. But when you felt this, you really felt it, and it just felt far more like an actual person than it looked.
Fascinating. Let me go to Ilan and sort of pose this question about this. I sort of like to promote a dialogue between you and Frank. I'm thinking about scale. And thinking about the questions you raise about legibility is how is a shape, a single shape legible? Is it legible to the fingertip? Is there up and down, back and forth movement? And then once a single shape is legible, how does it lend itself to a sequenced narrative? And is there an opportunity or an inclination of readers to I mean, is it a system that promotes a sequential reading, or are there other ways that different readers come to the work?
Yes, it's an excellent question, actually, and a very debated one. If somebody reads the available bibliography on what is called exploratory procedures, EP, exploratory procedures are the basic movements a user is doing with a tactile object. And I found out that a few of these exploratory procedures are very relevant for our research as comics artists doing tactile work. For example, there are procedures. One is about the pressure, you know, like when we take an object, we want to see its weight, we press it to see its resistance. There's another one that has to do with lateral motion. You know, we will spread our hand on it to see how big it is and how it feels. And there's also movements like contour, you know, like trying to understand the contour of shapes, or even enclosure, something that work in a more granular way to understand the tactile drawings. And I think that some of these might have a kind of equivalent with the way we also experience. We cited people a comic book page with a more like when we open a comic book, we have a sort of first peripheral brushing. We see everything, trying to locate ourselves somehow in the spread, and then we can activate the foveal vision, the more precise vision, in order to really read specific parts of the narrative. So I think the set of different exploratory procedures referring to tactility and some modes referring to the way we experience with sight a comic book have a lot of similarities. And I say debated because this is called also partial overlap between tactility and sight. And this is a very big debate. We don't know exactly. I mean, we don't know. There are many different opinions there. It has been very difficult for me as a researcher also to, because I didn't have the resources to have laboratory experiments and doing surveys. So I was based mostly in the bibliography, and I saw there are many different opinions in how common or how shared are the experiences related to tactile graphics. My own experience by doing these workshops is that people usually use all of these exploratory procedures without obviously breaking them consciously, in the same way when we read a comic, we don't say, I'm going to activate my peripheral vision. Obviously, we don't do that. But all the different gestures are used in experiencing of a tactile world. And what I find also very interesting is that it activates also because we know, for example, how comics are the more they are legitimate in academia and scholar studies, the more they approach modes of access to the text that are related to close reading, to really trying to understand all the references of the work. But activity somehow activates a much more distracted reading, which I think is very, 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 very interesting and very, very related to the way we also we also experience media content in the age of attention economy. We can speak also about this for a long, because something I'm very, very interested. But yes.
Yeah, all sorts of things there. I do want to bring Frank into it, and I know Nick or Emily, what time is this panel end? It feels like we could go all afternoon. I don't want to do that.
We've got about 15 minutes, so maybe we'll go to Frank, and then I'll throw in some of the questions.
Yeah, good. Okay, so Frank, I sort of want to invite you to comment as somebody who's making tactile graphics, for largely for informational purposes, but also with a lot of knowledge about how people derive information from tactility. I'm wondering if you could maybe I've heard you speak before about like creating diagrams and maps, and obviously you could have Braille there, but also try to create a tactile graphic that represents something. For instance, on the street map, here's a bus stop, or here's a BART station, or whatever it is. Maybe you can address a little bit of that, which would be relevant, or say what you want.
Yeah, I think that one thing to be aware of is that I think that we're really in a place of evolution in terms of tactile graphics. Not just, a lot of that has to do with the technology that we can bring to the production and distribution of tactile graphics that we never had before, but that has cultural and learning ramifications as well, because the truth of the matter is, because of the difficulty of producing tactile graphics and the expense thereof, that there are large segments of the blind community that do not have much experience, and therefore not a great level of literacy in working with tactile graphics. And we're at a point where that can change, and it could change in some interesting ways, because now we're in a position where we can use tools to produce tactile designs much more easily and in a much more robust way, and also then to mass produce those pieces so that we can get them under more hands more quickly. And that is going to be very exciting in much the same way that the printing press made such a huge cultural change 500 years ago, where suddenly, in a world that was largely illiterate, the economics suddenly made literacy relevant and accessible. And that meant that you had to build education systems to inculcate those literacy skills on a mass scale to match the new mass availability of written material. And the same is happening now in terms of tactile literacy and the availability of tactile graphics. And I think that that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. It's also an area where I think there's going to be a huge amount of research in order to refine what we do with tactile graphics and what we know works as a tactile graphics. So there's a great opportunity for evolution and growth. I think in terms of making the graphics understandable and usable. I think that a lot of that can come about through experience by working with people in the community to exchange their experiences, work and encountering the graphics and learning what works and what doesn't, and then using that as a feedback loop to develop the design techniques in order to take advantage of that understanding. I'm very interested to hear about Ilan's work that he's doing, because we've thought for a long time that it would be cool if we had something that was like a tactile graphics dictionary where blind folks could experience a lot of the tropes and the symbols that exist ubiquitously in the sighted environment and make those available in an organized way so that a blind person could learn, what do these different symbols mean? What do these different textures mean, and so forth. And I think what Ilan is doing, the way you create essentially a dictionary of these symbols that you're going to use in your pieces, so that people can learn those symbols and then apply them in the context of those art pieces is very exciting, and I think very scalable and something that can greatly enhance tactile literacy.
Frank, this is a very important project indeed. I have collected more than 5,000 different shapes, and I have tried to organize them in terms of, like we have this kind of organization for colors in Pantone, how can you organize shapes together? You can organize them in terms of the density of the shape. You can organize in terms of the drawing. And I think it's very interesting to see, to also try to somehow heighten our awareness of different tactile shapes and how they can be combined together, like in a very, very basic sensorial level. Some vertical lines are beautiful next to dots, for example, like I say a very basic thing, and it's really a big artistic experience to somehow experience this in a curated way.
Okay. All right, let's see if we can get a couple of questions from the audience. Nick, if you want to pull some out.
Yeah, here I am. So I've got two that dovetail with the sort of previous conversation. So we may, you may streamline the answer. And the second question will be specifically for Anne, just because the person directed it. But so this first part goes, are tactile works read left to right, right to left, all around? And then the question is, are there standards for tactile reading that creators can use to play with time and the order in which information is received? And then maybe I'll continue, and Anne, you can keep this in your mind and then I'll be quiet. Some of Anne's work clearly seems, this is a different questioner. Some of Anne's work clearly seems to imply left to right sequencing. And he gives examples. Can you reflect on users who perhaps do not follow the sequencing, but instead follow a different route?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Maybe so we'll go Frank and Ilan to address that question, then we'll get to Anne to talk about her work. So Frank.
Yeah, I think that I'm guessing that a lot of that goes back to that question of the person's experience. There are some people who are very comfortable touching things and some people who aren't. I just have to do a little aside here that at the Mad Lab, we have what we call our Please Touch Gallery, which is on the wall outside of the Mad Lab. And when sighted people come to tour the lighthouse, we find that they're very reluctant to actually touch the pieces in the Please Touch Gallery because they're socialized not to do that. And I think that plays into it is what is the socialization and the background and the culture of the person experiencing the piece. For example, if you live in a culture where writing is generally done from left to right, top to bottom, then I would assume that person would be more likely to explore a piece in that way, where perhaps in a different culture with a different writing system, they might explore it differently, or if somebody is right-handed versus left-handed. So I think it's very interesting, and again, an area that would be very productive for study, just to explore how a statistically significant sample of people naturally do tactile graphics, and do we find that one approach works better than another?
Yeah, I'll just interject something that's in my mind. When I learned Braille, which I learned as an adult, I was trained. I mean, that my teacher told me to, like, confront a page of Braille with my whole hand first, to like sort of rub my whole hand, the whole surface of my fingers over the page and kind of get an overview of like where are the paragraphs, what are the different things. And then, of course, a lot of really experienced Braille readers read with two hands simultaneously, or in sequence. So one hand is reading a line, and the other hand is reading the line below, and you sort of do a scissor thing down. But ultimately, it is always left to right, top to bottom. I don't know, Alon, are there sort of issues of sequence and multiple levels of touch?
Yes, I have a very quick response here. I'm a kid of French structuralism, and I would say power to the reader. We should not try to discipline the reader. We should only be in a position to suggest specific paths, and the sequence or the sequential reading of a work should be up to the reader to decide if they're going to follow our suggestions or not. And also, I think this discussion, I mean, in conventional comics, we don't ask this question anymore. It's a game. We can participate if we want, but we can also totally ignore it and make our own path in a big book, for example. In that we can start from the end. We can skim half of the pages. We can do close reading in one of the pages we are more interested. And I think I think we should try to keep the same freedom for also tactile graphics.
Good point. So that there's freedom, there's personal choice. Yeah, and there's also the possibility of multiple readings, right? That you can come back and do it a different way, a different time. And could you address this question with your own work? And in particular, I'd love to hear you say more about both, left to right versus right to left, but also the touch as not limited to the fingertips and not limited to sort of a sort of certain level of pressure. And
yes, the last implementation of Shape Reader engages the whole body. So it's a big room in a room where performers need to decide which part of the body are going to use as a reading device. So obviously this experiment draws in what is called embodied cognition, because our body is a reading device, is a device that is very well delved to understand grammars, to understand syntax, to understand meaning, to understand language in a multiple different ways. So each performer uses the body in very different ways. Some people use their back in order to understand, to read the score. Some people will play an instrument only with one hand and extend the second hand in the other hand in order to read the score. And I think also the way that somebody would engage tactilely with the work should totally be left up to them. Sometimes the hand is good in order to have a broad understanding of a shape, but sometimes it's very good to use the nail of the finger in order to have a very more specific understanding.
Yeah. Okay. Let me turn it over to Anne, because I think we're running out of time. So, Anne, if you want to.
Sure. Thank you. I know that I'm very strongly oriented from left to right, past to future, and I create my artwork that way. But I have noticed my students frequently also do that of their own accord. And one student, just touching back on the time element, one student created a piece of artwork, and along the top was sun, then some rain clouds with rain coming down, and then another sun. And along the bottom, he had created a horizontal platform that he was identifying as a sidewalk. And so he described it to us, and he put his hand on the picture, and he said, "I love it when I'm walking along and it's sunny, and then a rain cloud will come and it'll rain for a little bit, and then the sun comes out again." And he moved his hand across the picture during his explanation. And I just always really love that. So I know that because of, my culture, I read pictures from left to right as well as, text. I have had some experience with students. There's an exercise that I do that I say, I talk about abstract symbols and realism. And so we start off with a realistic circle and a square on a piece of paper. And then I ask them to, I say, okay, I'm going to say this is an abstract symbol for a man and a woman, which is which. And Westerners almost always identify the woman as the triangle and the male as the square. But that seems to fall apart from Middle and Far Eastern cultures of students that we have coming through. So it's not, a formal study, but it is something that I've noticed. So I do think that there are cultural things that really do influence how people interpret things.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, I think we've run out of time.
Yeah.
And is that right, Nick?
Yeah, this question, we have some fantastic questions, and I want to hear from everyone about another hour or two. But
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But we got to move on. So thanks to all the panelists and thanks to the audience for your attention. This has been really, really rich, and it makes me go from being, an ignoramus about comics to somebody who's really excited. I want to get my hands on all of this work. So Thank you.
Thank you all. And I'll just as a quick reminder, this is lunch break. So from 12:15 to 1 p.m. Pacific time, we'll be on lunch break, and we'll come back at 1 p.m. for the Emerging Technologies panel. So thanks to all, Georgina and the panelists. That was awesome. And I want to talk to you more, but hopefully soon. Thanks, everyone. See you in a bit.
Bye.